Good evening. Welcome to Ask the Archaeologist. We're at episode 6. Tonight, we're going to be talking about all of the questions that have been asked over the past week or so, and we're going to kick this off with our question of it's a clarification of a topic that we discussed last week. The question is, why are there fossils of snakes with legs if they lost their legs at the fall before the flood? So just to clarify this particular question, the slide that we were reviewing is this slide of this fossil right here. And we were looking specifically at this little section right here, which was a fossilized legs of a snake. Now, as I said last week, there is a gene called the sonic hedgehog gene, and it allows the snake to grow legs, but the legs never grow in fully. So what we're looking at when we're finding fossils with legs or little protrusions that resemble legs, these are not usable legs. All it shows is that they were capable of having legs, but that they actually didn't have legs that they could use. So we have the evidence that they did have them, but I hope that clarifies the question for CR. Now, moving on to our second question. And before we begin, I just want to take a moment and open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, as we dive into your word, please be with us. Help everybody that is listening to be able to understand the answers that are being given. If anybody has questions on their hearts, please help guide them to the answers that they are seeking, whether it be here or simply opening your word. Thank you for protecting us throughout the week, and be with us. In your name we pray, amen. Okay, so moving into our next question for the night. This question came in from AT7, and the question is Armageddon in Revelation a real place? This is a very interesting topic. And the reason that it's an interesting topic is because it does have to deal with events that are more than likely going to be occurring very, very soon. So when we're looking at Armageddon, it's often associated with the apocalypse. The apocalypse is the end of the world. We can read about this particularly in Revelation 16, verses 14 through 16, where it says, the kings of the earth and of the whole world gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty, and he gathered them together into the place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. So this is always associated with the end of the world. And there's a lot of conjecture about, is this a real location? Is this symbolism that is being used? That's still up for debate. However, we can go back in history and we can look at a place called Megiddo. Some people call it, there's Megiddo, Megiddo, Mageddon. There's a lot of different names and ways to say it. But if we look up the Strong's Greek, it means Armageddon, which means Mount Megiddo. And this is an actual location. So the Greek is referring us to an actual location that is in the valley of Jezreel. If we look in the Strong's Concordance for the Hebrew word, this is Hebrew word 4023, and it means a rendezvous, destruction, tower, to cut, to assemble, or to a place to gather troops. And this is a valley that we can read about, is particularly associated with King Josiah. And King Josiah went to go fight this Egyptian pharaoh that was called Pharaoh Necho II in the valley of Megiddo. We can read about this in 2 Chronicles 35:22, and we actually have the seal of one of King Josiah's servants. This servant is mentioned by name in 2 Kings 23:11, and this is the seal of Nathan Melech. So we know that King Josiah was a real person, that the servants that are mentioned in the Bible are actually real people. Seals were used to identify somebody. It would almost be like a driver's license or a social security card today, where you would, seal a document or a letter, or even jars of oil or shipments of crops that were being harvested, or sealing a door. We read about a door being sealed with Daniel. So, where is this located in Israel? Well, here is a satellite image. We can see the Sea of Galilee off to the right of the screen, right over here. Big, lovely sea. A lot of the New Testament takes place along the Sea of Galilee. When we are looking at the Sea of Galilee, we're going to go west of that. We're going to come to a place called Cana, which we should all be familiar with as the location of Jesus's first miracle. Then we come to a little place, you might have heard of it, called Nazareth. This is where Jesus grew up. If we go way far west over here, we see this lovely little place called Mount Carmel Park. Any ideas what Mount Carmel Park might be famous for? If you said, hey, isn't that the place where the prophets of Baal met up with the prophet of God, and the prophets of Baal didn't succeed, but the sacrifice to God did? You would be correct. This is where Elijah was up on the mountain, and he proved that God is the one true God. If we travel southeast of this location, down towards the lower half of your screen, we see this lovely little location called Megiddo or Megiddo. This is the classic location of the mount, but the valley that is known as Megiddo, or the Valley of Decision, the Valley of Jezreel, that location is actually right here, highlighted in yellow. Now, this highlighting is approximate, but this was a valley that is about 25 miles in length. It was the perfect place for two armies to come together and to fight, to regroup, to go back and fight some more. And it is within eyesight of a lot of these ancient locations that we read about, both in the New Testament and in the Old. And just to give you an idea of how close of an eye view it is to these locations, this is a view from the city of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. So Jesus is growing up in Nazareth, and if he were standing on these mountains, he could actually look out into the valley, and the valley that he is seeing is the valley that in the New Testament is being called Armageddon. Historically, in the Old Testament, it was called Megiddo. Here is the Megiddo National Park, and if you look off to the upper right corner here, this is Mount Carmel. So Jesus was looking at all of these different historic locations while he was growing up. How cool is that? And also within this valley is this fortress that we can actually still go through. The archaeological remains are there. This is the fortress of Omri, who was the father of Athaliah, who was one of the very, very wicked queens. This is the castle that's also associated with Ahaz. Here is another view of the fortress looking into the Valley of Decision right here. If we actually go into the fortress itself, here is an example of what they believe may have been one of the entrances, one of the gates. You can see how they used much larger stones for the more ancient building, and then they used smaller stones as fill-in for as the building has now crumbled, they're trying to restore it. So they're going to be using some of the much smaller stones as part of some of the restoration processes. And it also gives archaeologists an idea of the different layers. What layer was the original layer versus which layer is the more recent one. So, in all, yes, there is an actual place called Armageddon or Megiddo that is a valley, and it's known as the Valley of Decision because you would have to make a decision when you went to this valley on, if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to fight, if you wanted to flee, where you wanted to place your armies. Josiah made a very poor decision there, so it does tie into the fates of kings during their rule and the decision process. And it could very well play a role in end-time events, or it could be figurative. I will leave that up to you to decide. But what I can show you is the actual physical evidence of the location. And I see we have a question here. I do apologize. I am not able to pop up your questions on screen this evening. So yes, you can see the field of Armageddon from the top of the hill looking down towards Nazareth. I did show that a little earlier. I think I missed your comment a little sooner there, heaven soon. Moving into the question number 3 that we received. This is from CT. And for question 3, it's the Israelites marched around Jericho for 7 days. One day had to be Sabbath. Wouldn't that be breaking the Sabbath? That is a very good point. So when we are looking at the city of Jericho, let's refresh our memories. This is a representation of what historians believe the city of Jericho may have looked like. Ancient cities would oftentimes outgrow the city itself. When we are looking at the city of Jericho, we are looking at least 2 walls because the original city, was built, but then it expanded to the point that there were so many dwellings outside of the walls that they couldn't leave those people unprotected. They needed to protect those resources. So they built a second wall to encircle the city again. And it was part of this second wall that would have been the wall that Rahab was living on. And there are different historical accounts of various walls in ancient times. These were not just thin little, 1 cinder block walls. People were living inside of these walls in houses. They were anywhere from 20 to 100, 150 feet in width. These were huge walls. These were not anything that was very small. And when we are looking, we can actually go to the remains of ancient Jericho. Now, ancient Jericho was destroyed. There was a curse placed upon any man who would try to rebuild it. And for many, many years after its destruction, Jericho was not rebuilt until one king decided that he was willing to brave the curse and went ahead and rebuilt, and his sons died because of it. But when we are looking at the story, we have to go back to Joshua 6. This is specifically in reference to the city being destroyed. Joshua, the whole chapter is about this, but Joshua 6:3 particularly says, "And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus thou shalt do 6 days." And then it continues and says that on the 7th day, they were to circle 7 times. And at the end of that 7th time, the priests were to blow their trumpets and the walls were going to crash down. The men of war themselves wouldn't have to do a thing. How many people was this? It was not the entire dwelling of the Israelites. That was an enormous amount of people. We know if we go back to, I believe it's Joshua chapter 4, it talks about there being 40,000 men of war that were ready to go and attack the cities when they sent the spies in. So when this Bible verse says, all ye men of war, we know that there was at least 40,000 men that were trained and armed and ready to go. But then we also have the 7 priests with trumpets who are carrying the ark. Or the 7 priests with the trumpets, then the priests who are carrying the ark, and then it also mentions anybody who was armed could join in this. Now, the people of the city of Jericho, they were taking no chances. If you go back and you look at Joshua chapter 2, we meet a woman named Rahab. 2 spies of Israel have gone in. They are searching out trying to determine the best way to attack, what they're up against. Rahab hides the spies, and she says to them, we've been hearing all of these stories for all of these years about how the Lord went through and he opened the Red Sea for you. This was 40 years ago. Stories of the Red Sea are still going throughout the land of Canaan. And then on top of that, the Jordan River in the midst of the flooding season parts for them, and this is unheard of. If you've seen a big river like the Mississippi or the Potomac, that during the flooding season they're absolutely ginormous by themselves, and then you add flooding on top of that, this is not something that was naturally going to happen. So they were seeing this, and the people of Jericho shut up their city, and they weren't the only ones, but Jericho was like the leader of this little coalition of cities. So the people of Jericho shut up the cities. They were taking no chances. They're not letting anybody in or out at this point. And this is when the people of Israel are encircling the city and marching around for the 7 days. But prior to this, Rahab shows some faith. She says, I know that the Lord hath given you the land. So she's admitting, we can do nothing. The Lord gave you the land. But then she also has a confession of faith because she says, your Lord, he is God. He's the God of heaven. He's the God of earth. He is the God of everything. I am admitting my faith in the Lord. And I am asking you, can you, because I have shown this faith and I have shown mercy to you, will you show mercy to me and my family? Which is what they ultimately did, is they showed her this mercy. And the mercy was not coming necessarily from them. It was becoming because she declared her faith. She was showing, I fully believe, and please, protect me. So we actually can go through and we can see the walls and how they fell. And the outer walls fell, the inner walls fell, the retaining walls that were buried, of course, those did not fall. They didn't have a reason to fall, but we can still see that retaining level because you don't want to build something without having a firm foundation. And that's what we can see here, is we can see a partial firm foundation where these walls would have once stood. So Rahab acts in faith. A heathen woman is declaring the Lord is God. But then we have somebody who actually should be declaring that the Lord is God in Achan. And Achan decides that he is going to steal what is God's. This is why Achan and his family were punished so harshly, because they had already been warned. In Joshua 6:17, they had been warned that if they kept anything, not only would it affect them, so, hey, that's up to you, your crime doesn't affect me, I don't care. Well, in this case, they were told that whatever they did would affect the entire camp. So they not only took their own lives into their hands, they were willing to risk everybody else's. So God was extremely harsh with them because they knew better. They were claiming to be of God, and they were actually being blasphemous. Whereas we have Rahab, who is a heathen, supposedly, and she's proclaiming God. How do we know that they actually burned everything? Because we actually still have some of the jars. They burnt the city with fire, and everything that was therein, they burnt this stuff. This was valuable stuff. Grain was like a hot commodity in that day. You would not want to destroy the grain. And the grain barrels that they're finding are completely full and burned to a crisp. Normally, what would have happened is all the gold, the silver, the grains, some of the fabrics, these would have all been things that could have been taken back to wherever the originating enemy lived, and they would have used this grain. They wouldn't have left it behind. On the other hand, if the city had been under attack, all of this grain would have worked to support the city and feed the city during however long the captivity would have been. So if the city had been under attack for a while, the grain bins would have been empty. So this shows that the city fell very quickly and that whoever attacked it wouldn't have had a need to attack and take this grain back with them. So when we're looking at the destruction, why did this destruction potentially occur on a Sabbath? They were either marching on a Sabbath or the destruction itself occurred on a Sabbath. Well, let's look at the destruction. The whole point was to bring glory to God. That was making a point to the entire land of Canaan that God was God and that all the stories that they had heard all these years were true. It was something that had been commanded by God. It wasn't like Joshua said, you know what, I think this is how we're going to do it. No, God had a very specific purpose that he revealed especially for this particular case. All of the items from the city, nobody was to gain anything from this battle. That was not the point. Everything that was from this city that was taken, the gold and the silver, that was to be dedicated to God and used for God's purposes. And that is why Achan was so cursed, because he was stealing directly from God. So everything that was involved with this was to be dedicated to God. Now, do we have any other instances where we have Israelites that are doing something, or not necessarily Israelites, but individuals within the Bible that are doing something on the seventh day or on Sabbath that wouldn't necessarily normally be acceptable? And the answer is yes. They were commanded to bring the animals on the ark, and the animals came in for 7 days. One of those days would have had to have been a Sabbath. Was this something that was for their own glorification? No, this was something that God specifically commanded for a specific instance, and they were having to obey God. It was an act of faith. So the whole thing with Jericho, it was an act of faith. They were to do exactly as God said. It was almost like a test. Baby dedications. There's a verse in the Bible that talks about, the priest's work actually, occurs on Sabbath. Does that make it a bad thing? No, because they're doing the work of God. Babies were dedicated on the 8th day regardless of what day it landed on. Same thing with purification rituals on the 40th and 80th day. Passover. It didn't matter when Passover occurred. It would be, on the 14th day of the first month, regardless of which day of the week it landed on. So there were exceptions that were specifically designated by God. And Jesus, in healing the blind man or, saying, hey, you can dig this cattle that has fallen into the ditch, get them out. He's showing mercy. So he is mixing mercy with obedience to him. And in Jericho, he is working on their obedience. Will you do what I say, even if it doesn't make sense at the time? You're going to win a battle against a major city, blowing some trumpets. That's kind of like, I'm going to puff and blow your house down. They didn't really know if that was going to work, but they had to show some faith. Rahab had to show faith that God was going to take over. But it was also mercy. He showed mercy to Rahab for her faith, and he showed mercy to the blind man by healing him. He was showing telling them that they could show mercy to animals or the, people that were ill that needed the assistance right away in doing, certain actions. So I hope that answers your question about, um, why would God say, do this on the seventh day, and one of those days would have to have landed on a Sabbath? Question number 4. This has come up from several different individuals. The question is, who was Melchizedek? Was he Shem? Was he Jesus? There's a lot of discussion that goes back and forth about this individual. When we go back, let's look at when we first see Melchizedek. We first see Melchizedek when Abraham is coming back from a battle. His nephew Lot was taken hostage along with all of the people from Sodom. Abraham goes and he takes his crew of 300 fighting men and 3 friends of his from around the area of Hebron. And they go and they track down Lot's captors, and they take care of them. And on their way back, they're passing through an area that had the town of Shalem or Salem. This is an early form of the word Jerusalem. We get the word Jerusalem because the Jebusites eventually took over this location and added their name to it. But originally, the city was not called that. Originally, the city is called Salem or Shalem, the city of peace. So Abraham is coming back. He's getting to the city of peace, and he meets with the king of this city, and the king is named Melchizedek. We can read about this in Genesis 14, specifically verse 18. We can also read about Melchizedek in Psalms 110:4 and Hebrews 7, 1 through 21. The question comes about because of some of the traditional writings. The Bible itself does not list any information about who this king of Salem was. We look at the book of Jasher and the Babylonian Talmud, where it says that, okay, this is Shem. The Dead Sea Scroll, I believe it's 11Q 13 or 14, that says, oh no, he was a heavenly messenger. But like I've said before, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Talmud, the book of Jasher, none of these are actually 100% accurate. So we cannot rely upon those particular sources to base any fact upon. When we are looking at, who this Melchizedek could possibly be, we got to go back to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 is the Table of Nations, and this Table of Nations gives us 70 individuals who went through and set up all of the nations and kingdoms upon the earth. And then from this 70, they branched out and more nations were formed and new coalitions, and everybody starts off and, I'm going to set up over here, I'm going to set up over here. But the original ones all come from this particular list of 70. And we have to remember, Abraham is only born 352 years after the flood. So all of these 70 individuals, this is all still happening while Abraham is alive. And this is somewhere between when Abraham is 75, when he first enters Canaan, and before the destruction of Sodom, when Abraham is 99 years old. So Abraham is somewhere between 75 and 99. Some sources say that this is about 10 years beforehand. So Abraham, they're guesstimating that he's about 89. But we know for sure that it was between age 75 and 99. So this Salem, this city of Salem, is very interesting because a lot of times people were not naming the cities like, oh, the city of peace and the city of this and the city of that. They were actually naming the cities and the regions after themselves. It's the people of God that we see naming cities after themes like peace. So right off the bat, this tells us that most likely this Melchizedek is a worshiper of the one true God. As we're looking to see if he is Shem, we don't see any association with Shem and Melchizedek. We don't see any people that could be a variation of the name Melchizedek within any of the lines. If we particularly go and look at the line of Ham through the line of Canaan, being as this is where all of these events are taking place, we do not see any name of Melchizedek here. We know that Shem's family stayed more up towards the Turkish region. Same thing with Japheth's family. We're not seeing anybody named Melchizedek here. We do know that Shem and Abraham lived at the same time for about 150 years, but there's nothing that says that they actually met in the Bible. If Abraham was a descendant of Shem, which we know he was, and Shem is Melchizedek, we don't see Abraham greeting Melchizedek as a direct ancestor, like we see with when they're meeting with Rebecca and Rachel and Laban. We don't see that familial relationship here. Abraham is meeting Melchizedek as an equal or as a co-worshiper of God, not as, oh, hey, my great-great-grandfather, how are you doing? We also, don't see if Melchizedek was right in the area and had been in this area, why, if he was Shem, why wasn't Abraham using his name, Shemite or Melchizedekite or something similar from somebody right in the area that was obviously highly respected, instead of using the name Hebrew, which comes from the phrase Eber or Heber. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense about why this would be associated with Shem. Could it have been a descendant of Shem? Absolutely. There's not a doubt that, it was either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. Take your pick. You've got a 1 in 3 chance that he was a descendant of Shem. But was he actually Shem? Bible does not say. When we look at Hebrews 7:3, it says that he's without father or mother or descent, which literally translates as he doesn't have a genealogy. This is not somebody that, can be traced. It wasn't of that great importance to list it. There was no reason to list it. The only purpose was the fact that, hey, Abraham is not the only person on the planet who has this knowledge of God. There are other people in the general vicinity that are worshiping God. It also meant that Melchizedek didn't have any inheritance in the promise. So the promise was given to Abraham's family, not to Melchizedek's family. So while Melchizedek is living in this area, he is not part of this promise that Abraham is a part of. So when Paul is writing in Hebrews, he is pointing out that Melchizedek is not a part of this. And by saying, if you continue to read, by saying that Melchizedek has no record of birth or death, that literally removes the possibility of him being Christ, because Paul is using him as a type of Christ, and everybody knew that Christ had been born, and everybody knew that Christ had risen. That was part of the whole message that was going on. So it was very obvious in the days in which Paul is talking that Melchizedek was not in reference to Christ, but in reference to the fact that Christ was not a Levite. He wasn't a Levitical priest, that Paul was not a Levitical priest, that none of these disciples were necessarily of a particular lineage, that lineage that was specifically appointed back in Numbers and in Exodus for the priesthood, but that he was of a different lineage, that you didn't have to be part of this particular lineage to be able to worship God as commanded by Christ. This Melchizedek is listed as king of Salem. We actually have what appears to be an ancient temple that is very close to the Temple Mount. It's directly, I believe, south of the south wall of the Temple Mount. This is thought to have possibly been the temple where Melchizedek would have been performing his services. This is an artist rendition of what it may have looked like. This is imagery of the actual location. It is underground, and that's why you can see these steel beams and these girders here, is because this is actually what is holding up some of the modern city of Jerusalem. All right, I do see that we have a question. It says, in Genesis, Noah got drunk and passed out naked. His son walked in and saw him naked. When Noah found out what happened, he curses Ham. Why did Noah do that when he was the one who got drunk? That is a very interesting question. So let me finish this question here, and then we can get to that question. So king of Salem. So Melchizedek is an actual king of Salem. So we have evidence of one of his potential, worship locations. He's living in Canaan. He is worshiping God, and he was a priest there. Do we have any record whatsoever of Christ actually living on this planet, acting as the king of one particular city when he was here? There's only one record of Christ ever actually living among the people of this planet, and that is in the New Testament, several thousand years after the events that are going on in Abraham's day. So there is no record of Christ actually being a king of an actual city down here. That was the whole point when he came, is that he did not come as a king. He came in a very much lower class as one of us, to show that it could be done and that eventually he would be crowned king. But he did not come as a king to live among the people here. Now, places like Mount Sinai, he showed up as a king. Ark of the Covenant, hovering over it, leading them in the cloud of fire. That was showing that he was the king, but he didn't actually rule in one particular city as a deity, communicating back and forth with people and giving offerings and offering up offerings. Do we have other records of people being priests of God before this time frame? Yes, we do. It's a man called Jethro. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us who Jethro's father is. If we look at the traditional records, it says that his father was a man named Hanok, who was the son of Midian. We do know that Jethro is a Midianite, so we know that he is descended from Midian. We do not know exactly how many generations, but this gives us a good idea of, what may be the lineage of Jethro. But Jethro goes back to Abraham. He was not a Levite. The Levites are over here. He lived before the Levites, but he was called a high priest or he was called a priest of Midian and a priest of God. This is they're called the tombs of Jethro. They could be tombs that actually belong to Jethro, or just in the general vicinity of where Jethro lived. But these are interesting. No bodies were found inside the tombs. They were empty. But this region in the land of Midian does associate these tombs with a man named Jethro. Joseph is associated with the high priest of On. And people have often questioned, was this high priest of On actually one of the worshipers of God, or was it a heathen priest? We don't know. I don't know if Joseph would have married somebody that was, a pagan worshiper. We do know that she was given to Joseph by the Pharaoh, so there is that possibility. But we do know that Joseph was a very godly man. So, and we do know that Abraham had been in that general vicinity and spreading, everywhere where he went, he spread the word of God. So it's very possible that there could have been converts in Egypt that were actually worshiping God at this point. But there are priests that are mentioned prior to the Levitical priesthood that are worshiping God, that are in the Old Testament: Melchizedek, Jethro, and potentially the high priest of On. So this is more of what is being talked about in reference to the order of Melchizedek, where it wasn't important that you were descended from Levi, but that the whole purpose in your worship was the worship of God. So I hope that that answers your question about Melchizedek. Was he Shem? Was he Jesus? What is the priesthood in the order of Melchizedek? It is a very in-depth subject, so hopefully our brief overview will answer that question. So, to get to the question of Noah that comes from Megan, that is a very interesting point. One, as Heaven Soon has commented, he didn't curse Ham because he couldn't curse what God had already blessed. He cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. There are some interesting points when it comes to why Noah particularly cursed Canaan and not all of the sons of Ham. Why this one in particular? It's theorized that it was actually Canaan who had been egging Ham on and potentially the one that was tempting Noah, and that Noah didn't necessarily know exactly what he was getting himself into, or that God was willing to overlook Noah's overindulgence, whereas an event occurred between Noah being in his private household, doing his own thing, not being a public nuisance. It was a private sin, and either Ham or Canaan, or Ham at the instigation of Canaan, went in and committed a sin against their father's household. And so therefore, when Noah was back in full capacity and in total control of himself, speaking through God, having God speak through him, ended up cursing Canaan because, one, he couldn't curse Ham, but because, two, Canaan was just so much more vile and had some part in this. Because there is a verse in the Bible that does say, the sins of the father shall not fall upon the children. So that would lead me to believe personally that Canaan did have something to do with the events that had happened, whether directly or indirectly. Was he even alive at this point? Don't know. But he indulged in the sin of disrespecting and dishonoring Noah. So that is why the curse was placed upon him in such a large decree rather than on Ham himself. So I hope that answers that question. Do we have any other questions tonight? There was a lot of questions regarding dates for biblical events. Why, does the MT differ from the LXX and Josephus? When does the 7 years tribulation start? So I'm thinking about next week, or as one of our, future study programs, diving into some of the, when did biblical events occur? Some of the timelines and the differences between some of the historic dates, why these dates exist. So if that is something that, you'd be interested in, I'm going to try to get, some of these answers into our upcoming programs. But if this is something that you think we should dive further into, maybe we can have a series that specifically is looking into, dates, times, and placing events within the Bible. So if that's something you're interested in, please drop it in the comment section or, in our form on our website, and we can, think about, how we're going to approach that. In the meantime, just keep sending in your questions as is, and we can see about getting, them answered briefly, but and cover them as much as possible. I am seeing a question that we can go ahead and we can, let me just exit here. I'm going to open up my slideshow here to answer a question. Okay, give me 1 second because I've got slides that'll answer these questions. Okay, so this is a question that pertains to timelines, of course, about Christ. So when we are looking at the timeline for Christ, how do we know that the timeline for Christ is accurate when Herod was born, or when Herod died before Christ did? And I actually do have some slides that pertain to this. So let me just plop these up here because we've got to go back to actually Zacharias, because Zacharias is a little bit older than, not Zacharias, but Zacharias' son is a little bit older than Jesus was. And we can look at the timeline for John to look at where Jesus was. So John is 6 months older than Jesus. We can read about this in Luke. We know that Elizabeth conceived, then an angel appears to Mary about 6 months later, and Mary goes, she stays with Elizabeth for 3 months. John is born, Mary leaves, and then 6 months later, Jesus is born. So when we are looking at the timeline for Christ, we see that he was baptized when he began to be about 30 years old. When we look at the word began, that means when he turned 30 years old. And this is interesting because Jesus is called the great high priest. We can read that in Hebrews 4:14. We're told that if we go back to, I can't remember, I think it's in Exodus, where it says that a priest began their service when he was 30 years old, and he would serve between the ages of 30 and 50. And actually, let me find that verse for you, because I like to back up everything by verses. All right, so it's Numbers 4:3. We can read that priests were doing their service between the ages of 30 and 50 in Numbers 4:3. So Jesus is baptized at 30 years old. If we go back and we look at when Jesus began his ministry, this is going back to Daniel chapter 9 with the 70 weeks. We know that time frame began in the fall of 27 AD when he was baptized. So when Luke says that he began to be about 30, when you actually look at the Greek for that, it's when Jesus turned 30, he was baptized and began his ministry. So if we go back 30 years from the fall of 27 AD, and we go back 30 years, we have to remember there's no year zero when we cross from the AD going back to the BC dating. That puts Jesus' birth in the fall of 4 BC. We know that Zacharias would have been serving in the temple in 5 BC because John is 6 months older than Jesus. So we know when John was born, backtrack that. That's 5 BC for conception. We know that Zacharias was of the 8th order. We know that all priests began their priestly orders at Passover. And then after the week of Passover, we can go through, and it was order 1, order 2, order 3, all the way up to order number 8. So when we look at this, we know that Zacharias was serving in the temple between June 13th and June 26th of 5 BC. We can be very accurate on this. So after, the 26th of June, Zacharias went home, and Elizabeth would have conceived between June and July, which means that the angel is talking to Mary sometime around Christmas, between Christmas and New Year's-ish, depending on, when Elizabeth conceived, which means that John would have then been born around Passover time, which means that Jesus would have been born, September, October of 4 BC. There's really no getting around, this timeline when we're looking at this. This also brings up an issue, because if Christ is born in the fall of 4 BC, the secular historians have Herod the Great as dying in March or April of 4 BC. So they have Herod dying before Christ was born. So that poses a really big problem. But the problem actually is not that he died in 4 BC. It's they've associated his date with 4 BC, and this goes back to Josephus. Josephus is the one who was writing about Herod the Great. They didn't have, BC AD dating back then. They dated stuff by the rules of, this king ruled for this long, and, this king ruled for that long. When it came to Herod's death, Josephus associated it between, he didn't even give the date of a year. He said it occurred between the feasts. So it was between an eclipse and the feast of the Jews, which was the Passover. There were actually 3 eclipses that occurred during the time frame in which Christ would have even been in the general vicinity. One of those eclipses was March 13th of 4 BC. This is the one that that has to be it. That's the one where Christ was born. That's actually impossible. So it actually would have been closer to the eclipses that occurred as far as Herod's death, 1 BC, January and December. So we know that the wise men didn't show up until probably Christ was about 2 years old, maybe after 2 years old, and Herod didn't die until after that. So Christ would have turned 2, 4 BC fall, 3 BC fall, 2 BC fall. That meant that King Herod could have lived for another potential year or more after the wise men left, and it would have been sometime between January 10th of 1 BC and December the 29th of 1 BC. So this is where we have to really double check, and I always enjoy doing this, going back and double checking our secular sources with the Bible and actually seeing what did the eyewitness accounts, what were the people saying actually at that time versus how the historians have listed that time today. Because if you actually go back to the source material and look, you find that it's not always exactly as written. This is why research is so important, because if we went with the secular historians, it would actually be proving the Bible false. But if we actually go with the historians who are writing shortly after Christ, the time is actually much more accurate. And we have a potential of 3 eclipses, one of which is an impossibility. We've narrowed that down because of the birth of Christ, which leaves 2 other eclipses, which both, they have equal viability. So I hope that answers that question about how do we know when Christ was born? And I see that we have another question on here. It says, in the Old Testament, the story where Joshua sent the 12 spies into Canaan and the spies come back with a report of men of great stature. Could the men of great stature have been cannibals? This is from 29 of a Kind. So it is possible. So this is actually, if we go back to when the Israelites are still at Mount Sinai. So they have just come out of Egypt. And they're on their way. They were on their way to the land of Canaan. They got detoured. They're hanging out at Mount Sinai. God has spoken to them. He's told them, here's my plan for you. Follow me, worship me. We've had the golden calf incident. And the spies are sent into the land to say, okay, how are we going to approach this? Because, we've got our, 600,000 men who are, of fighting age. Plus we have all of these other people that we are trying to take care of. Our women, our children, our elderly, the mixed multitude that is part of this group. So we need to know what we're up against. It's possible that Moses had some sort of an idea and gave them directions. I want you to go here, had a battle plan figured out. But when the spies came back, the spies are like, oh boy, we cannot approach these people at all. We are puny compared to them. We're like grasshoppers, and they're these humongous giants. There's no way that we can do this. And it got to the point at which they were actually willing to kill Joshua and Caleb, because Joshua and Caleb said, in the name of the Lord, we can actually go and do this. And the people sitting there, oh no. And it wasn't just the 10 spies that didn't want to go. They convinced the rest of the people that were part of Israel that no, we would be better off killing Joshua and Caleb than actually going in to get rid of these giants that God told us this land is ours and he will give it to us. They lacked faith, total and complete faith. And so God said, you know what? Okay, it's like this. Your lifespans, 120, 150 years at this point. That is not unusual. Nobody that is over the age of 20 is going to be walking out of this desert. And I'm only giving you 40 years in this desert. So this was a drastic measure. He was effectively cutting their lifespans in half or more by making them stay in the wilderness. Because we look at lifespans today, okay, 70 years, 80 years, average, I think right now is between like 72 and 74 years old. So spending 40 years in the wilderness, you're already 30, okay, you're already at the end of your life, so that's not really punishment. But if your lifespans are actually 120, 130, 150 years, and you're at that 60-year mark, you've still got, a good chunk of time that is remaining on your lifespan. And to be told, hey, you're not coming in. And think about the people that are like in their 30s and are 25, and they're being told, you're not going in. And it was because they lacked the faith of God to go in and do this. So God had to take them right back through the same idea again with the crossing of the Jordan. And this time Joshua sent out 2 spies who the people that they met told them, in Rahab, hey, we know God is with you and that God has given you this land. So, they took that report back and they said, even the people are afraid, we can do this. And they had to show faith by marching around the city. Now, as far as who these giants were, we know that some of them, King Og, for instance, who was, just shy of 16 feet tall, who was considered the last of the giants. All the years later, we have Goliath, who is, quite at the height of, I believe, 11 feet 1 inch or 11 feet 2 inches tall. So they're pretty big. And at this point, we also have to consider that the people that were the Israelites are also large. We went over cubits last week with the archaeology files, where the cubit that Moses was using was 20.6 inches, which from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your finger is actually much larger than today, which would indicate that the people at the time of Moses were actually of a greater height than they were at the time of, say, Daniel, where they had switched to using the shorter cubit. So the people that are the Israelites were potentially, 7 or 8 feet tall. So to come back saying that these people were giants, King Og, last of the giants, 16 feet. You could count his offspring, maybe they were between, 11 and 14. That's still much, much taller. And in battle, that would not be good. Were they cannibals? I wouldn't put it past them. These were pagan nations. They worshipped pagan gods. And we know for a fact that the pagan practices involved human sacrifice. Whether or not they were actually consuming the human sacrifices, I honestly can't say. But there are some indications that yes, this may have actually been a practice in some of these pagan nations in that area, which is why, God said you can't allow these people to stay. Even if you did allow them to stay, they're so evil and so wicked that if they stayed, it's like a plague. It would consume you. So you need to be done with this. So in answer to your question 29, yes, they most certainly could have. Do I have any physical archaeological evidence of that? At this moment, I do not. But if I went looking through some of the tablets, I might be able to find something where the different cultures are actually talking about this type of behavior. So I hope that answers your question. We are at 1 hour. Time has flown by so fast. If you do have any questions, just let me know in the comments section or send an email, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram. Find a way. We'll get the questions answered. So God be with you. If you want to join us tomorrow for our archaeological files seminar, we will be talking about Noah's Ark, continuing our discussion. That will be at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So hope you can join us either live or on a recorded broadcast. Thank you and have a good evening.